All right, hello everyone, and welcome once again to another episode of Galaxy Beacon. I'm Matt.
I'm Carly.
And I'm Rob.
And today we're going to kind of do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about kind of what got us into Star Wars in the first place, how we fell in love with Star Wars, what Star Wars means to each one of us individually. I think we each have slightly different stories for specifically what got us into the franchise, and I think it'd be cool to kind of talk about that and see that different people come to Star Wars in a different way, and different people have different kind of perspectives because of that. So, Rob, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about how you first got into Star Wars. Was there a particular film or a particular book or whatever that really hooked you on it, and kind of what does Star Wars mean to you throughout your life? Let's get your opener on that.
Well, I grew up on a small dairy farm, so we didn't have a lot of entertainment, and I wasn't around kids my age, really. My parents weren't really big into movies and television or anything of that nature, so we didn't have a whole lot of entertainment to go on. But when the Star Wars films came back out into theaters with the special editions, my sister was like, Rob, you really should see this. And so she got permission from my parents to go see the movie in theaters. And we went and saw it, and it just blew my mind. It was nothing like I'd ever seen before. It was the first science fiction that I had ever really seen. I had seen a couple of Star Trek movies on television, but they weren't anything really to call home about.
And about how old were you at this point?
Let's see. When did A New Hope get into theaters?
Originally?
No, not originally. For special editions. Was it 96?
Yeah, sometime in the mid-90s, I think.
Yeah, so it would have been about 11, 12, something like that.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. And so I saw that, and then I read the novelizations for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
And that was my introduction. And actually, before I saw Empire Strikes Back, I had actually read Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. So, yeah, it's kind of odd. The movies are not exact. I don't run to the movies as Star Wars. The books, the expanded universe, have always really been Star Wars for me because that's how I experienced them the first time. And actually, my brother had told me the story of Star Wars before I went and saw any of them because he had seen them when they were on television, that rare occasion where they were on TV before that. And he had told his version of it, which was nothing like the actual films.
Right.
But it was interesting because I had imagined something completely different, and then when I saw them in theaters, it blew me away.
So, I mean, you grew up on a dairy farm. Luke grew up on a moisture farm on Tatooine. There had to be some sort of attachment to Luke as a character, really identifying with him in a way that maybe some other people didn't. Because, I mean, you literally kind of grew up in that sort of isolated farm environment.
And I'll tell you, it really did speak to me in that way because Star Wars is to a degree escapism.
Right.
But Luke literally was escaping from the same thing I was. The dull, everyday life. There's more to this than the moisture farm. His going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters. Yeah, that was entertainment for me too. We would go into the farm supply store to get, parts for the tractors. It's the same thing. And it was neat to see another farm kid who got away from the farm.
Our cat is making a lot of noise. So that's really interesting. So, I mean, you really kind of got a chance to really identify with Luke and kind of fall into Star Wars at kind of the perfect time. You said you were around 12 or so, which is a pretty good time to see it.
And I'll tell you, just like Luke standing there looking at the sun's falling over the moisture farm, I did that many times. I was just standing there looking over the cattle in the fields and just watching the suns go down, going, please let a starship just crash down and take me away.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll go next. And once we're all done, kind of with our initial stories, we'll talk a little bit more in depth. But I was introduced to Star Wars really young. Young enough that I don't even remember how old I was. It's just some of my early memories are watching Star Wars because my parents had the VHSs lying around. And we would have, my babysitter come over when I was a real little kid. And whenever she wanted me to just chill, there were three things she could do. She could get out my Legos, and I would just sit there and play with my Legos. She could put on pretty much anything Batman related, and I would sit there and watch it. Or what she ended up doing kind of more often than not is she would put on Star Wars. And so Star Wars was something that I just has always been in my mind. Like I don't even have a way to put in a frame of reference of what it would be like to live having not seen Star Wars. Like some of my earliest memories are Star Wars. I remember when I was a little kid, I used to get terrified at the scene where Luke got his hand cut off in the at the end of 5. Like I used to look away from the screen every time, and I would just hear Luke's like screaming, and I would be like, "Okay, has he finished screaming? Okay, cool. I can look back at the screen now." So like that's kind of some of my earliest memories, but in the same way, Rob, I'm kind of like you. That is not necessarily like the movies do not fully define Star Wars to me because at the same time, growing up, some of the first books I started reading, outside of what I had to read for school, like growing up, some of the first novels and kids books I read were Star Wars. There was a series of like junior kids Obi-Wan novels that I read. I read some of the novelizations. I read a lot of Clone Wars novels, like Dark Rendezvous, and Shatterpoint was one of them with Mace Windu. Like I read a lot of those growing up as a kid. And one of my earliest memories was I was about like 7, I think, in 1999. I was about 7, and seeing seeing The Phantom Menace in theaters is one of my earliest memories. I remember going to see Clone Wars, or not Clone Wars, Attack of the Clones, in the theater with my dad, who saw them all when they originally came out in the 70s and 80s, and he freaked out when Yoda walked in there and pulled out his lightsaber and started fighting, because he was just sat there going like, what am I even watching right now? And I was sitting there like losing my mind and getting all hyped for all the TV spots for episode 3. So I remember all of that really vividly as like a really little kid. But yeah, at the same time, I almost find it hard to remember a time where I wasn't reading Star Wars books and playing Star Wars video games. I think what really truly cemented my like I'm in this for life was probably the video games I played. Star Wars and the Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, is pretty much my favorite game of all time. And the 2 KOTOR games are like 2 of the earliest RPGs I ever remember playing. Jedi Outcast, Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast has like a very strong place in my heart, and I got an Xbox specifically so I could play Jedi Academy. I begged my parents for an Xbox specifically so I could play that game because my parents were not going to buy a PC that was good enough to handle those games at the time. Yeah. So like Star Wars has always been this like multimedia thing to me. Like it's been the movies, yeah, but it's also been books and it's been video games. And so that's why I'm so happy with what's going on right now. We're in just kind of this new era of great, awesome explosion of creativity in Star Wars material. I just hope the video games can catch up. But yeah, that's how I got into it, was just kind of, I've always been into it. And I can't even remember a time before Star Wars. Carly, tell us about how you got into Star Wars.
Well, I don't have quite the same story at all. The first Star Wars movie I saw was Episode 4. I was 16, and it was in my English 4 class. I had never seen a Star Wars movie. I only know, I knew the line. Like, that was about what I knew about Star Wars, was I knew the Luke, I am your father, that was referenced in pop culture everywhere, and of course that's not even really the line, but that's what's in everything.
Yeah.
That's all I knew about Star Wars. So we were reading Beowulf in the Old English and everything. We were studying epic poems, and my teacher was just like, you know what? We don't really have time to like do a whole lot about this. Let's just watch Star Wars, and then you can write a paper on how Luke embodies the hero's journey.
Yep. I wrote that paper.
So we watched Star Wars in English class, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a Star Wars film. The main thing that I remember, like, I didn't love it, to be honest with you. I thought it was fine. All I really remember was anticipating that line the entire film, and the line never came. Like, the whole time, I was just like, oh, is this going to be the scene? And then suddenly, they're getting medals, and the movie's ending, and Darth Vader never said that he was Luke's father. I was just like, what just happened? I don't understand. I had no concept of the fact that there were 6 Star Wars films out at that time. I had no idea. So some point after that, I just kind of watched movies and stuff on the movie channel, and sometimes I would see a Star Wars movie come on. To just further the weirdness of my own Star Wars story, I did not see episode 5 and 6 after I saw episode 4. I saw all 3 prequels, because no one showed the originals on like random movie channels. They showed the prequels.
Yeah, especially at that time.
Yeah.
Because the prequels were pretty new.
So, I mean, no, they weren't. They'd still been out for like 10 years.
Relatively.
But, so I watched episode 4, and then like, I didn't hate episode 4, so I still was like, you know, I'm interested enough to watch these when I just see them on the movie channel. So I just kind of casually watch episodes 1 through 3. I'm just casually like, yeah, I like Darth Vader because that's my thing. I always like villains. That's just something that always appealed to me. I liked Maleficent, was my favorite Disney character for a really long time. I like villains, and I liked Anakin. So I liked Darth Vader casually. The first Star Wars movie I ever saw in theater was the re-release of Phantom Menace, which I dragged my best friend in high school to go see.
That was the 3D re-release,
That was the 3D re-release when they were going to re-release all the different movies in 3D, and that never happened.
Best 3D redo I've ever seen, by the way.
Never saw it.
I saw it.
It was actually like, I'd seen a bunch of films in 3D at that point, but the episode 1 3D actually worked. It was, I mean, there's better 3D since, but it was just really good 3D work. I just really sad that it didn't take off. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, so my first experience actually sitting through the entirety of like episode 1 was in that theater. Since that point, I watched like episode 2 and 3. It was not until college that I finally saw episodes 5 and 6. So
I was there for that.
yes, you actually made me watch them.
Yep.
So yeah, I was just a really, really casual Star Wars fan until Force Awakens came out. After Force Awakens came out, I left the theater being like, yeah, I guess that movie was okay. But being that I was really into other fandoms, and I was just kind of had this reputation as like the geeky one in the family, the rest of the family was under the impression that I was a big Star Wars fan. They still bought me like Darth Vader stuff all the time, even though I really hadn't watched many of the movies or anything. So after Force Awakens came out, we saw it the first time, and I was like, this was an okay movie. So I came home for winter break from college, took my grandfather to see it because he was a big Star Wars fan back in the day. And then I came out of the theater that second time, and I was like, no, there's like something really, really good about this movie. And I suddenly became really attached to some of the characters. And then I proceeded to see it a third time and dragged my parents to see it because my dad also liked Star Wars. It just wasn't something he'd ever shown me as a child because it wasn't something my mom really cared about. So then I ended up going to see Force Awakens 16 times in theaters. And from that point on, I have just been really, really into Star Wars.
How many of those times did I go with you?
I believe you went with me 13 of the 16 times.
Of them,
yes.
Because we met in college, and I was surprised that you. I was surprised. I wasn't like it's it's honestly pretty normal for people to have like gotten to college age and not seen Star Wars, like honestly. But like I was surprised that you had seen the ones that you had seen. Like I've seen 4, I've seen the prequels, and that's it. I'm like, so you haven't even. That's just odd. Like either you've seen all of them or you've seen none of them general.
I've seen a random assortment of Star Wars films.
So what was it like when you saw Emperor Palpatine? I guess it wasn't that impressive to see him in Return of the Jedi because you'd already seen him turn into that.
I already knew who he was. That's not.
That's so it's and
I mean I saw Anakin Skywalker before I got much time with Darth Vader.
Yeah, I mean you'd only seen episode 4 at that point.
Yeah.
I remembered when the Force.net started the Jedi Council, which was the first real Star Wars forum that was easy to find. You didn't have to subscribe.
Like even to this day, the originals still don't have much power with me, which is blasphemy, kind of. I don't know. But
yeah, you're a big...
like as characters, like Luke never resonated with me at all. Yeah. I don't recognize Luke in myself whatsoever. I don't personally find him relatable or interesting or anything like that. Whereas
he is
like
one
Anakin,
of the least interesting main characters, really, when you get down to it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true from a storytelling perspective, but like most people, like some people at least can find something like in him that they see in themselves. And I never saw that, and that was part of the reason that I kind of liked traditional like villainous characters a little bit more, was traditionally because of my own personality that wasn't normal, I guess. I saw myself in them more. So I really resonated with Anakin a lot more than I did Luke. So I just liked the prequels more.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true for me too. I mean, I never really grew attached to Luke, and I liked all the characters. I don't think it was until the sequel trilogy with Kylo that I found a character that I personally felt I related to on some personal level because of my own past and stuff like that. But it's interesting where, you know, Rob is pretty unabashedly, you know, very much an original trilogy guy. Carly, you're very much the sequel trilogy and the prequels. Mm-hmm. I try to love all of it. Although, I mean, yeah, some of my biggest experiences are seeing the prequels in theaters and then seeing the sequels in theaters. I think it's fair to say that, gun to my head, I might choose the prequel and the sequel trilogy as my two favorites. And I mean, granted, the sequel trilogy isn't over yet. But, you know, coming to Star Wars from so many different ways, it's really interesting the way that you kind of view the franchise depends on where you came in at it. And I mean, ever since Force Awakens, you've then kind of fallen in love with the greater Star Wars universe.
Oh no, now I'm like a super fan, which isn't unusual for me because throughout my childhood I was a super fan of a lot of things.
Sure.
And I just never latched on to Star Wars in the way that I did a lot of those things until the sequels came out.
Well, I think that's important to note is that, like, one thing that's cool about the sequels, you know, for a while there was a trending hashtag, it was like hashtag Rey fangirl or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was this cool celebration of the fact that, like, well, I mean, it didn't start that way, but people then turned it into a cool celebration of the fact that, like, Rey and The Force Awakens and the sequel trilogy in general has provided a new latching on point for people. People who, you know, maybe they missed the boat on the original trilogy, they just never saw it. Maybe the prequels didn't resonate with them specifically, and now they're either at the right age or the storytelling in the sequel trilogy just hit them in a way that the other ones didn't. And that has now opened up the floodgates for, like, a love of this franchise. And I love that about Force Awakens.
And it's not necessarily what's on the screen. I admit it. I don't really watch the original trilogy that much because when I watch it, you know, the special effects aren't that impressive anymore because everything's been used in everything else. And but every time I think about it, I still get that joy and I still get that excitement because, you know, a small 12-year-old kid, you're not just watching what's going on the screen. You're adding to the story inside your head. And then when you're at home and all you have to do is go milk the cows or whatever your job is. Well, I mean, as a kid, I guess most people don't have those type of jobs. But anyway, we're not going to get into that. But you know, you create you recreate those images in your head and you add so much more. The Death Star was so much larger. The fights were so much more intense, and when you go and watch the movie, it doesn't really live up to it, but it's okay because your brain's supplying all the extra information.
Sure.
I think that's a really interesting point because Carly is the only one of us who did not watch the original trilogy as a fairly young child.
No, I never watched any of them until I was basically an adult.
Yeah, you were 11 or 12.
Yeah.
I was like a baby. Whereas, so like you're
I
right.
was
Like
almost 17.
yeah, we watched those original trilogies for the first time, and we didn't see the dated effects. We just saw this space battle happening. Whereas Carly, that has to be kind of an interesting perspective coming at it. You didn't see them till you were late, mid high school. So I mean, it had to have been interesting. It's like watching Richard Donner's Superman after you've seen a bunch of other superhero movies.
Which, you also tried to show me.
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate Richard Donner's Superman in quite the same way because you have a very different frame of reference for it the first time seeing it if you've already seen, modern day superhero movies because it set those kinds of standards. So same with, Star Wars when it came out.
Kane.
Yeah, exactly. Or Citizen Kane, one of those like classic stories that now we've seen that sort of story done before, but it's hard to put ourselves back there. In the 70s, most sci-fi was pretty doom and gloom, and so for Star Wars to come out and be revolutionary in terms of storytelling in the science fiction genre and in terms of special effects, that's kind of the same thing as seeing it as a little kid. It's like this brand new, fresh thing. Whereas seeing it as a young adult for the first time, it's just a very different experience. So
Yeah.
Honestly,
Like the first time I watched it, I related to it because I liked Star Fox at the time. And like, of course, Star Fox is kind of a ripoff of a lot of things in Star Wars, but that's not how I related to it. I was watching that movie and I was like, Han Solo is Falco Lombardi.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just like, it's just... So I don't know.
No, I mean,
everyone brings different experiences, and since I already had other frames of reference, that's kind of how I experienced it my first time.
Oh, for sure. I don't think I would have gotten into DBZ as hard as I did if I wasn't like into the classic Sega Genesis Sonic games, which DBZ or rather those borrow from DBZ, but I was exposed to those first. So I mean, for sure. And I mean, Rob, so I mean, you were... you're a little bit older than the two of us, without getting into that too much. So
I'm still a millennial.
Still a millennial.
Still a millennial.
Technically. So what?
Which is the only way to be one.
Yeah. So I was like 7 when the prequels came out. Mm-hmm. I don't have a real great frame of reference for what the reaction was. I only have the reaction in hindsight. By the time episode 3 was coming out, I was maybe 12, 13, something like that. So, Rob, what was when you saw the prequels, what was your initial reaction to those?
Well, initial reaction was it was great to see more Star Wars.
Yeah.
And then, like, you walked out of the theater and you were kind of like, well, they kind of just showed everything. There wasn't much left up to the imagination, because the older ones, there was still a lot left to the imagination. But the special effects were very different. It added a lot to the film. But then I just made the unfortunate mistake of going on the internet and seeing what other people's opinions were. And
that good old 1999 internet.
Yeah. And also there was another thing going on in Star Wars about that time, which was publishing companies had changed for the books. And the new publishing company for the books was starting the whole Yuuzhan Vong thing. And I read one of those books, and I pretty much was like, no, Star Wars is destroyed forever. It can never come back. And
Yuuzhan Vong killed it.
They did.
That's fair.
And I was fine with them killing off Chewbacca. It was just...
So you were not one of the people sending R.A. Salvatore death threats?
Oh, no, I liked R.A. Salvatore. But it's just the whole... I didn't like the way it was going. It felt like they were trying to push Star Wars in a direction it wasn't ever supposed to go. To me. Because,
I mean, George Lucas definitely felt that way.
Yeah, he did. But Episode 1, it really... it was a fun watch, but it didn't feel like Star Wars to me. And it felt like Lucas was kind of just doing his own thing when the fans were pretty clear what we wanted to see. Shadows of the Empire had come out, which was a multimedia, not multimedia in the sense like a video or something, but as in there was multiple different types of media that were being involved with that campaign. There was the video game, there was a soundtrack, there was a book, comic series, all of it. And all of it was canon, all of it was high, really high quality for those individual types of things. And like all of it seemed to get thrown out. Immediately when episode 1 came out. It was hard for the fans. And actually, when episode 2 came out, didn't see it in theaters. Didn't even see it when it came out on DVD.
You were boycotting it.
I wasn't boycotting it. I just literally didn't care anymore about Star Wars. I still had my dog-eared copies of Timothy Zahn's trilogy, the Thrawn trilogy, and that was Star Wars to me. I had Stephen Sansweet's Encyclopedia of Star Wars, and I believe that's pretty much when Star Wars ended. So I lived in my own little Star Wars world there, but episode 1 really wasn't part of it, and I let it all go. And I also withdrew from the community at the time.
Yeah.
And then episode 3 came out, and I was like, well, yeah, at first wasn't going to go see it. But right before episode 3 came out, they also did the DVD releases of the original trilogy.
Yeah.
I watched those again, got all my excitement back, and it's like, look, George Lucas, he's going to do something with this. So I went, I rented Attack of the Clones. I was okay with it. And it's like, I'm really just watching this so I can watch episode 3 and see how he finishes it up. And then I watched episode 3, and I was right back there. I was right back in the midst of it. I was like, yeah, this is good. The storyline all worked together. You can see how it moves into the next film.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And it got me back into just, accepting Star Wars again. I didn't really fully come back until I watched Rogue One.
Wow. That's a pretty decent chunk of time there.
Yeah. Well, I also had a girlfriend that just, she thought, that Star Wars was for kids. And I kind of had to give up on it. But yeah, it was a long time. But I played some of the video games during that time, so there was little bits of Star Wars. But it really wasn't until Rogue One where I was like, no, I love Star Wars, every aspect of the universe. Are there parts that I enjoy more than others? Yes.
Sure.
But that's the story of the Star Wars universe. Like, people are like, well, if this happens, I'm going to disagree with it. I was like, no, if this happens, that's what happens. You don't get to pick and choose. It's, I do like that Disney did reset the canon, because there was too many things that were just getting weird.
Yeah.
The Clone Wars series, I will say this, the Clone Wars series really primarily brought me back, but it was really hit or miss. Like, I wasn't 100% sure which episodes I had seen and which episodes I hadn't.
Yeah.
And then Rogue One came out, and I was like, no. And I went and bought them all on DVD and did a straight-through watch, made sure I got all the episodes. And right now I'm trying to go through some of them to listen to the director's commentary on those.
Yeah.
Fully brought back to Star Wars at that time.
Yeah, 2000 to 2005, that 5-year span, we had like a ton of games put out in that time frame. That early 2000s window, because I think Revenge of the Sith came out in like 2003, I believe. So I mean, that early 2000s window, they really just pumped it full of crazy Star Wars action. But one thing I think is interesting that I did want to say is that, Rob, you and I both read a lot of the books. I remember reading about Jason and Jaina Solo and Lobaka and Tenel Ka and all their adventures with the New Jedi Order. I remember the Yuzon Vong War. I remember it. I was there. I still get the flash. I'm sorry, that's a terrible joke. But, I remember a lot of that stuff. And then Carly, who didn't really become a fan until Force Awakens, it's kind of interesting to me how you've become this big mega fan. You've read, a lot of the new canon books and the new canon comics and stuff like that. But you don't have the same attachment to the EU that a lot of people have. And I feel like that gives you kind of a different perspective. Have you ever thought about going back to that material at all?
Well, not really. It's not that, I don't know how to say this diplomatically. It's just not canon, so I don't really see the point in it.
Turn her mic off. Turn her mic off now.
No,
It's not, like, I don't know.
Well,
It's an issue where the thing that brought me back is the new stuff, so why would I go back and read what was different from the stuff I actually like about Star Wars?
I think there's a fairness there, and I think there's also a fairness in saying there's so much stuff coming out that is new and current. It would be hard to keep up with all that stuff.
First of all, I haven't read all of that yet.
Yeah, there's still novels I haven't read, so it's hard to keep up with all that stuff and go back and familiarize yourself with stuff that is not going to be relevant to the story that's being told.
And I don't know. I know a decent amount about some EU storylines, and I'm not honestly all that impressed with most of what I've heard. Like, what I know about Thrawn, I like him a lot better in Rebels than I even do in his books now. So I definitely don't know that I would have resonated with that character in those particular novels back then. For like Jason and Jaina, like I think Kylo Ren is fantastic, and I just don't think Jason could live up to that now that I've seen Kylo Ren.
And I mean, I agree with that as someone who read those books. And I don't mean, I just think it's interesting that like Rob and I both had that history, and then you don't. And so
I mean, like,
you
I
come
could
at it with
read
a different
them.
perspective.
It's just that, like, instead of you reading these Legends book and then being told, like, this is canon, this would be me, like, I already know this is canon, and I'm going back and reading this anyway, so it's going to be hard to look at it with as much validity in the first place.
And it's not like Disney's not recanonizing stuff. We may still
a lot of it
see,
still is coming back.
Like, and they drop hints all the time. Like, in Thrawn's office, he has statues of Yasal Almiri. Not sure why, because I mean,
they might exist. We don't know.
It's a clear nod to the older generation of fans.
Yeah.
But I'm like, why would he want to have engraved Yasal Almiri behind his desk?
Are they ever called Yasal Almiri?
I mean, they just look like
they just
them,
look
yeah.
like what
I guess
they're described as.
we're calling
we assume that that's what they are, but we don't know. But for all we know, they could exist.
And then Rook, his bodyguard, which is a Nagri.
I remember fighting Nogri in Jedi Academy.
Yep.
You had to fight a bunch of those guys. They were annoying. They were also much taller.
Yeah. And also, I mean, Rook in original, back in Legends, is the one who killed Thrawn.
Yeah.
And when they killed Rook off, I'm like, that means they're not going to go with that storyline.
No, because but what they did was better.
No, I mean, no, well, but you don't know what the original storyline was.
But I love Rebels. The end of Rebels is so good.
No, it was. I mean, I do not blame them for doing that, because they did a great job with everything.
I love the way Thrawn was handled in those last 2 seasons of Rebels, for sure.
And but I do kind of wish that they had done what the original story for the Nagri was amazing. Vader lands on a planet, because he crash lands on a planet because of the damage that the ship does in the crash landing. It poisons their land, and there's an invasive species that basically is toxic now because of the crash. And Vader helps the Nagri survive by supplying them with technology to help clear these, basically, if you're from the south, kudzu, this really fast-growing plant. And then, for their help in saving their society, they pledge themselves to Vader as his personal bodyguard. And then, I don't think they ever really went into detail on what the event was, but Vader eventually, as a favor to Thrawn, honors him by giving him the Nogri as his personal bodyguards.
Yeah. There's definitely this weird relationship between people who like the EU and don't like the new stuff, people who are brought into the franchise specifically by the new stuff, and then people who like what of the EU they know and like the new stuff. It's definitely not a zero-sum game here. You know, you can like one without liking the other, and for some Star Wars fans, the EU was never part of their Star Wars experience. For other people, it was. So it's just kind of interesting how we all come to it different places in our lives, different feelings on it. I guess, Rob, if you had to kind of think about what does Star Wars kind of mean to you as a person? You know, what impact has Star Wars had on your personal life and your outlook on the world? You know, what has that been, if anything?
Well, definitely. It was extremely helpful for me growing up because I had great difficulty reading books.
Yeah.
Unless it was really dense theology, which I know seems like an odd thing, but I could read theology, but that was about the only thing I could pick up a book and read and not have a problem with it. Any work of fiction or something that wasn't dealing with those specific subjects, I could get about a chapter into it and I couldn't understand what was going on. And I wasn't sure if it was people's writing styles or what the nature of it was. But Star Wars for me was very helpful because I had to read all these different authors and their different ways of writing, but it had one coherent story. And as long as they stuck to that story of, and the Star Wars universe, I was okay and I understood it enough. And, over the years I got pretty good at being able to pick up any author and read it perfectly fine and still follow the story and everything.
I will say that's one thing that I'll give the EU is that some of the big problems I do have with the post-Disney buyout with the material is just that we'll get some things like Poe Dameron comics and I'll read some of the books and then I'll go to the theater and see the new episode and see that it disregards a lot of the information we got in those books. And so it's kind of like, this is what's canon. The EU didn't have that because everyone writing those books cared, so they read each other's books and they made things flow.
And they had what they referred to as the Bible.
Nowadays we have, they had a respect for what each other had written so that everything was consistent. Whereas now we're getting, the writers are fantastic, but then the filmmakers kind of have more freedom to do anything. They don't have to adhere to anything that's already written. So now we have things that are canon that kind of contradict each other.
Yeah, I think when you look at the books, the comics, and even the TV shows, those all have a synergy with each other that I think the movies have not quite kept. And
I'm not saying it makes the movies bad or anything. It's just that I read every single Poe Dameron comic and saw the way the First Order was portrayed in an interesting way after The Force Awakens, and then Last Jedi came out and it didn't have any of that nuance, and it was just kind of, they just are this bad guy and they don't have any noticeable principles or anything that were outlined. It's just kind of simplified, and it's an issue that back in the EU they didn't really start writing those books until all the movies were out, so you didn't have that problem.
Yeah,
until episode 1 came out, and then we definitely had that problem.
But now we're releasing books in the middle of them, and the filmmakers are trying to tell a good story on their own, so they're not necessarily keeping up with the books, and the writers are trying to tell a good story, so it's not always perfectly cohesive.
It's interesting what the filmmakers will kind of look at and what they won't, because Rian Johnson looked at the Mortis arc when he was writing Last Jedi, and I stand by that. The stuff he did with Luke and Kylo and Rey and sort of the nature of the Force is my favorite and strongest stuff in The Last Jedi. So he's looking at that, right? And then you're on the nose 100% where you read Phasma and you read the Poe.
We talk about how the First Order is so different from the Empire and how they don't believe in a lot of things like slavery and stuff like that.
And then none of that.
And then none of that was in the film, so that was just as someone who really cares about the First Order, and I latched onto that group of villains and stuff.
They're given a nuance in the books,
that they don't have in the movies, and then we have people just being no, they're just a ripoff of the Empire, and I'm but if you read the books, they're not.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
But the movies aren't. But it's a complicated situation. It's just that, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that is something the EU did not really have. They had more consistency.
But the EU also had the issue of everything was really pretty nebulously canon. I mean, there were very few things in the EU.
The books were canon to the books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, basically there was tiers. There was the movie canons, which no one could touch. Then there was the TV canon when the Clone Wars came in. Mm-hmm. Then there was the book canon, and then there was the comic canon, and then there was this like source book information, and then there's like
Yeah, for
game
most of
canon.
you, I'm pretty much just talking about that like 30-year period when there weren't any other
Tons
things.
of novels.
Yeah,
Yeah.
before like the prequels came out and kind of threw a wrench in some things.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of, you look at, like, Force Unleashed, which, like, was officially dubbed canon by George Lucas at the time, which is unfortunate, because it's not the greatest story. But, you know, I don't
I have not.
I think
Can't
EU
say.
versus current canon, and I don't even like putting it in terms of versus, because I don't like to compare them in a rivalry sort of
Yeah.
sense. I just like to look at how they're different.
Yeah.
Because I don't like to get into that. Like, I don't like to be like, you have to love the EU and hate the new stuff, or you have to love the new stuff and hate the EU. Like, that's just not... You can love both.
I would like Shadows of the Empire to still, in some way, come back.
I mean, and I make no bones about the fact that I wasn't the biggest fan of Rogue One, and I kind of miss Kyle Katarn, but, you know, we all move on. But I don't want to get into that right now. I kind of want to get back into, Carly, what does Star Wars mean to you on kind of a personal level? How has, you know, you came into it later than Rob and I did. Like, Star Wars was very formational
Yes,
to me
Star
as a
Wars
person.
was not formative for
So,
me at all.
to you, do you notice that Star Wars has had any major impact on kind of who you are, how you view the world, you know, beyond just, I now see all the Star Wars references?
Yeah, I mean, for me, fiction in general has always been really important to me. Like, Star Wars didn't form me, but fiction in general definitely did.
Yeah.
My first fandom was Sonic the Hedgehog.
Woo!
And I latched on really hard not to, like...
You and me both.
Yeah. So, I just started, like, I don't know, something about certain characters always really appeals to me.
Yeah.
I grasp onto characters that I have a lot in common with, but that maybe some things I don't, and I relate to them. So, like, I don't know, with Sonic, it was Knuckles. Knuckles the Echidna I latched onto. I thought he was really cool. Just kind of taught me some of my own morality and how to act around people and stuff, and how to be a good person. I think with Star Wars, like, obviously the person I've latched onto the most is Hux. But
Not teaching you how to be a good person.
well, see, but I think that even characters like that have positive traits that like help me in my day-to-day life.
Like when you
I
need
can
to
think
focus
about
in
how to
on
be a more
something.
focused, disciplined person, how to like save face when somebody is not being all that great. Like Kylo Ren's up in my face, then I'll be okay.
When the Kylo Rens of the world are throwing a fit in your face.
Then I can just sit here and just be like, okay, whatever,
Yeah.
you're a child. I'll get over it.
That's cool.
So yeah, that's kind of how I view characters like that. Like I can glean something from you even if everybody else just thinks you're a generic bad guy.
Yeah.
But for Star Wars, it's kind of like I really like the themes of it. It's just helped me come to terms with like who I am as a person.
For sure.
Because I've always resonated with like villains, and for a long time I was really into like Batman. I latched onto a bunch of the supervillains there. And with Star Wars, we kind of have the major villains come back from the dark side a lot, so that's nice. Like I liked Darth Vader. He was
Yeah.
my first like favorite character. Anakin was my first favorite character. Because he goes to the dark side for like all the right reasons and then gets lost and becomes a terrible person. But then he does come back like right at the end. And
Yeah.
Luke believes that he can come back, and that is great for me. You don't like I see people say that we see that a lot in fiction, but we really don't. In a lot of fiction, we see characters who are evil for like real reasons, and it's kind of ignored. Or they're just beaten down and called evil, and we just defeat them. And that's the story.
Harry Potter, I don't think anyone's redeemed in Harry Potter.
That's
Malfoy
is.
But
Yeah.
Draco kind of is.
but Malfoy was a kid that
yeah,
was
but-
just
yeah, exactly.
kind of bratty, not
Exactly.
actually an evil
Like,
person.
none of the adults who have done evil things, like, I mean,
His-
you have, like, Snape, but that's not really a redemption since they wrote it in that he was actually kind of a good guy the whole time. Yeah, like in Harry Potter, it's very much like Voldemort and the Death Eaters are evil, horrible people, and we kill them, and that's great. Like, Harry Potter's a great story. But, I'm trying to think of a better
Snape's
example.
a weird redemption
Yeah.
before you met him, but he's still just as cruddy a person as he was before.
But in a lot of things, we have...
I'm very uneducated on Harry Potter.
Really?
I have seen the movies a couple times. That's about it.
But yeah.
That's all you needed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
There's more in the books, yes.
I think that's
but-
very true. I mean, being introduced to Star Wars at such a young age, I think I always had, that idea of redemption being a theme, and that. I think that was always in the back of my mind growing up. Facing up to your fears, and also being willing to give people second chances. When you're a kid and you're watching Star Wars and you see Vader get redeemed, you're not thinking about, oh man, but in that novel, he murdered all those people. Or you're not thinking about all that. You're watching a bad person realizing that there's still good left inside of him.
And that it's okay to, be good now. You don't have to be bad. Just because you've done bad things, you can recognize you've done bad things and still come back from that. And so Star Wars for me was another way to do that, because that's what I latched onto in every previous fandom. When I was really into Sonic, that's what I liked about Knuckles, was other characters considered him kind of stupid because he believed it when the bad guy came to him and said that he was a good guy now, and he would fall for it. And of course the bad guy never actually was good, but Knuckles believed that they could be.
Yep.
He believed that, Dr. Eggman could be good this time. And then, in Batman, we have characters, some of those villains, who have been formed that way by actually really horrible things that have happened. Batman can give, kind of horrifying examples of real-life situations that happen in society that creates these monsters. And Batman, while he does beat them up, in general, he sends them to get help. And if there's some way that Bruce Wayne can help by, donating money, he does. He sends them to an asylum, not to just prison for the most part.
Well, Batman comics were always so good at Bruce Wayne / Batman.
They talk about a lot of, social issues.
Yeah, every villain is kind of a reflection of something inside himself.
Yeah.
And in that same way, even the worst parts of humanity and even the worst villains, they reflect something that we potentially see in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly feel that way about Kylo. It's why I feel so strongly about wanting to see a story where Ben gets a chance to atone for what he's done, because I relate to him on a personal level for a lot of different reasons, and also because that's always what Star Wars has been about to me. Star Wars gave me that moral compass. The Jedi were always supposed to be about peace and compassion, and it's just interesting the way it's formed me as a person, the way it's formed all of us as people, and it's hard to kind of shake Star Wars from just the public consciousness of the world, really. It's all become so, a large part of all of our lives in that way. That we latch onto these stories.
And I mean, beyond just what it means to us individually, it is something super important, and it's a super powerful story, and you can tell because we have, 3 people right here who've been through such different experiences and come to this fandom in very different ways, and we're still all here, and we are friends, and we can talk about Star Wars, and we might have different opinions on different things.
Yeah.
Rogue One forever.
Yeah. See, we're not going to agree with that, but...
I can take it or leave it.
But, you can love that, and then people latch on to all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And it's just really powerful.
I think that's another thing. I always... as much as I say I don't really personally like Rogue One, and I can list my reasons for personally just not really getting into it, but at the same time, that's the thing. We all come from different places. We all latch on to different things. That gets into a broader discussion of, critique of art is never objective.
Yeah.
It's always based on your personal experience with that art overall, with art in general, and based on your personal experience with that particular viewing of it. And so because everyone views Star Wars for the first time under different circumstances, not only circumstances as far as, who and when and what time of day, but different circumstances as in everyone is raised a little bit different, everyone personality is a little bit different. So everyone brings something different to any art that they view, and especially Star Wars. And one thing I love about Star Wars is because we have all these novels and comics, they're getting outside the box. Some of the comics have told kind of horror-esque stories. Some of the TV shows have told stories that are slightly different in tone and genre and style. And I think that that's okay because it broadens the appeal of Star Wars. Because Star Wars is a massive universe where any story can happen. And because of that, almost anyone can find something to latch onto in Star Wars. And I think that's part of why it's so big.
And I think it also, a nice thing about Star Wars is it does fulfill what George Lucas was looking for, which was a fairy tale, a space fairy tale, to share his moral and religious views.
Yeah.
Which were you can kind of see it. They're mostly Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that we're beginning to see now, and I'm hoping with episode 9 will finally come full circle, is those things like maybe the Jedi were evil. And
I think they touched on that in Last Jedi.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think when episode 9 comes out, although I know now George Lucas has handed off and he's not really able to, we're not fully getting George's vision anymore, but it's still there. It's a nice secular morality that we have where you can watch Star Wars and you don't feel like, oh, well, this is coming from this religion, that's coming from that religion, and we have those little infighting. We all kind of agree that the morality that we see in Star Wars is something to aspire to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was something that, Alec Guinness, right, Sir Alec Guinness, one of the only real veteran actors in episode 4, right? He came to the role because it was a small budget science fiction film in the late 70s. Sir Alec Guinness took the part because he liked the idea of playing a mentor figure in what was essentially a morality play. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's kind of what Star Wars has always been. It's a space fairy tale. And with the sequel trilogy, we're getting into this kind of self-re-examining of that morality tale. Kylo Ren kind of is that. He flips some of what we know about the dichotomy of the light and the dark on its head. We're kind of in the phase where we're now reflecting on our own thing that we've created. And George Lucas was doing that a little bit in the prequels too. And so Star Wars is this big thing that starts with this morality story, then it starts with this backdrop that's really complicated politically. Then we've got this whole self-analyzing meta thing with the sequel trilogy. Whatever. And it's just interesting how Star Wars, there's so many different angles in Star Wars and so many it means. And I'm excited because, Ewan McGregor recently said that he was really happy to see kids who, like me, who were like really young, like 7 when the prequels came out in theaters, who are now growing up and are saying, you know what? No, we like these. Awkward, stilted acting and dialogue, weird writing. Like, yeah, I'm not going to act like they're amazing, perfect masterpieces of cinema, but Ewan McGregor has talked about how, like, excited he is that there are people who are making their voices heard now who, like, that's what made them fall in love with Star Wars was the prequels. And there are people who the sequels are what made them fall in love with Star Wars. And so it's just, I love all of it. And I love that people can come in at different times and share different points of views.
Since I've come back to Star Wars, I've really watched more of the prequels than anything else. Because they really were good.
Yeah.
It's just, they weren't what I was expecting.
Yeah. Well, the prequels added so much to Star Wars in terms of the world building, and they took this thing that was a small morality play that took place on a handful of planets and expanded it to a whole universe visually, I think. Yeah. I like the prequels a lot.
Yeah, and they injected politics, which I love space politics.
Yeah, I like space politics in Star Wars too. And
I'm sorry, but I love space politics.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll always be that person who wants more space politics.
No, yes. I promise you.
I love it. Some of my favorite episodes in there's an episode in Clone Wars that I latched onto real hard because when you watch the prequels, you're just kind of like, oh, the Separatists are just the bad guys who are being manipulated by Palpatine. But then there's like an episode of Clone Wars where like Padme's ex is like a Separatist and she is like talking to them and they're like, no, we have like concerns, like we have legitimate things. And like, yes, their cause is being manipulated, it's being co-opted by Sidious, but, you know, it was cool to see those
I
politics.
want to do like entire debate episodes. Maybe next week we'll start.
Oh,
We should do a debate series.
A debate series?
Yeah,
I love
just
it.
on the different moralities for like the 3 different time periods, what the wars were really about.
We'll talk about the populists
Politically.
and the centrists and Bloodline. Bloodline is really great for that political stuff, and I don't think Bloodline happens.
I don't think
without
we can
the
get
prequels.
through a podcast without recommending Bloodline.
I mean, it's like your favorite book.
I love it.
Yeah.
And I'm probably not going to make it through on Audible. The person who reads it does a great job, especially her Leia is a.
Do you feel like if you keep mentioning Audible on everything, they'll eventually approach us to do an Audible sponsorship like they do with all the other big YouTubers? Not that we're big at all.
Yeah, no. We are not funded by them. We probably never will be.
I know.
But
I can dream, dang it.
I don't really do audiobooks. I like reading.
It's not because it's Audible. It's because these audiobooks, Disney puts a production level on them that is acceptable.
Now, Rob,
Yeah.
did you listen to audiobooks back in your old getting into Star Wars days?
Yep.
I mean, I certainly didn't.
I had one audio cassette tape of The New Rebellion by Christine Catherine Rush.
Okay.
And it was amazing because it had all the little... I mean, it was nowhere near the production quality of today's. But it was also a political one. They blew up the Galactic Senate during the time of the New Republic. There were... R2 and C-3PO went on an entire mission together, which was one of the few really R2 C-3PO centric ones. And this was, of course, done before the prequels. So when C-3PO kind of goes through a droid factory and it kind of has an existential crisis, if I remember right.
As always.
And then seeing that in episode 2, it wasn't when I first saw it that I realized it, but it was like on a couple watchings later, it's like, oh, that's why I like this scene that really isn't that interesting, is because it does remind me of The New Rebellion by Christine Catherine Rush.
I'm trying to think if there's any, like, particular books I read that I, like, really latched onto super hard. And I remember there was one, what was it? It was, like, a prequel to episode 3, like, Labyrinth of Evil, I think, by, like, James Luceno or something like that.
Yep, who also did
He did the
Catalyst and Tarkin.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so, like, Labyrinth of Evil, I read this one that was a prequel to episode 1 called Darth Maul Shadowhunter, and it's this whole thing where, like, Darth Sidious is like, you need to hunt down this guy and kill him. And so this guy is on the run from Darth Maul the whole book he's on the run from Darth Maul. And at the end of the book, he manages to barely escape Darth Maul, something like that. It's been many years. And he's on, like, Coruscant, and he manages to get into the main building of the politics, where all the politicians are, and he, like, opens the door, and it doesn't say exactly who it is, but he sees someone and he runs in and he grabs them and he's like, oh my god, I'm safe. There's this like madman after me, but I'm safe here because I know that wherever you are, it's gonna be safe. And then the next sentence is something to the effect of, like, and then Palpatine was just like, oh yeah, of course you're safe here. And it's so good. And I remember reading that and being like, oh my god, so cool.
Palpatine has always been and always will be my favorite Star Wars character, and a lot of it's because of the EU in the comics when he's reborn. That is some crazy stuff that goes down. Luke turns to the dark side for real, not as a ruse. He actually turns to the dark side. And but one of the neat books was the Darksaber, which was the guy who originally designed the Death Star in the Legends. Every time he failed at something, the Emperor would kill him and then transfer his essence from his current body to a clone body with the full memory of how he killed him. And they were just horrific killings. But anyway, after Palpatine died, and I don't know why they glossed over Palpatine coming back in the books, but he worked for the Hutts and built just the laser.
Just the laser
Yeah,
part.
so it was called the Darksaber because it was just it was like, it actually, if you ever see a drawing of it, it is basically you've seen Star Trek, The Journey Home.
No.
It's just a cylinder. But it's a probe that is coming back to Earth to find out why why the whales are gone.
Oh,
and it's
that
destroying
one.
the
Okay.
Earth.
Yeah.
That is the same design.
It's interesting to me how many named things, like you got the Darksaber is now something else, Starkiller is now something else, something else entirely. Of course, I mean that's kind of a different.
Oh yeah,
reference,
and
but-
and that was one thing. It's like the reusing of the names. You kind of get a little ticked off. Like, no, that has to be this.
Oh, that doesn't bother me at all because Starkiller was a pretty generic character in those games. But
Starkiller was the original name for Luke Skywalker.
Well, yeah, obviously, but
That's really what it was renaming.
yeah. But I mean, a lot of people probably didn't know that when Force Unleashed came out. I don't know how many people cared at the time. But
I mean, if you knew much about Star Wars, I feel like you knew.
probably. What is your favorite character is Hux? Like,
Yes,
total
hands down.
in the entire franchise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No questions.
Okay.
Definitely
Mine's
Hux.
probably. I really like Kylo Ren. I relate to Kylo Ren
I
in a
like
lot of
Kylo.
reasons. I like Rey a lot.
And specifically Armitage, not
yeah,
Brendel.
Not Brendel.
We hate
Brendel's
Brendel.
a monster. Of the original trilogy, I've always been a big fan of Leia and Han, and Lando. And, of course, Obi-Wan. Everyone loves Obi-Wan.
Nope, not everyone.
Carly doesn't like Obi-Wan that much. But, yeah, this is getting real rambly. Does anyone have anything else they want to say before I make us stop?
I mean, I feel like I already kind of ended that discussion, and then you guys talked about the EU for a while.
Hondo and Maz have to get together in episode
Let's
9.
just reiterate
Stop it.
every
Stop.
video.
Bad.
Mazdo
Mazdo. So are you on AO3 writing
or Hanaz.
Mazdo fan fictions?
I mean, what I do on my personal time is my business.
All right.
I'm-
Well,
I'm-
I'm just saying when I look up that tag, I'm not finding any fan fiction, so I'm just very sorely disappointed.
Yeah, because I want to
Well-
read those.
Because I'm sending it directly to Lucasfilm. Why am I going to just put it
okay.
on the internet? They're going to publish this. That's going to be.
Oh, okay.
You're just sending the manuscript straight in.
Well, it's a quadrilogy.
Kathleen's desk is
a
just full.
So that's
And she just has to pick which one is the best
So
one.
is Ryan Johnson's trilogy secretly this?
It's just Maz and Hondo.
It's Maz and Hondo getting together.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is.
All right, well, I'm
Kathleen
excited.
told me not to tell anyone, but
Oh, well, you heard it here first, folks. I'm excited for that. Now I'm going to be disappointed when we get the trailer for. If we get the trailer for Ryan Johnson's trilogy,
Why are you
several
disappointed?
years from
That's
now,
what we're getting.
And if it's not that, I'm
Why?
gonna be
Why would it not be that?
I don't know. That's better than anything anyone could ever come up with ever. So it's obviously the best idea.
yeah. I don't know how Chewie's going to handle it when he finds out, though.
Well,
I don't think Chewie
Yeah.
shares the affection that Maz has for him.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's all I got.
Why are we still talking?
I don't know. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I mean it. If you made it to the end of this episode, thank you. I appreciate you personally. So next time we'll talk about something that maybe makes us ramble on
No,
slightly
next
less.
time we are going to talk about politics. We'll probably start with the Republic. Galactic Republic versus Separatist politics. That's what we're doing next
I'm
week.
gonna have to
for
rewatch
sure.
a lot of Clone Wars.
Yes.
All right, cool. So
We're going to
we'll
do a series. That's what we're doing next week. The week after, we'll do something else, which is in the same series. We'll probably do Empire versus Rebels.
Great. All right, sounds like a
We're
plan.
going to go ahead and set that up.
All right.
That's what we're doing.
Okay, cool. All right, good. So that's what we're going to do. But thank you guys so much for listening. I mean it. We love all of you. And once again, I am Matt.
I am Carly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm Rob.
I hate you.
You can't end every podcast saying that.